Today's daf we're going to learn is Bava Batra daf kuf kafbet. There's a study guide for today. It's on the second part. When we get to the next Mishnah, just kind of organized it briefly. We're going to have four different interpretations of the Mishnah, but we're going to start today's daf with a question. We're actually going to end the daf also with a question, somewhat of a coincidence. We're going to start with the question at the bottom of Kuf Kaf Aleph. So the question was asked: Eretz Israel nitchalka lishvatim ifluk udilma lekarpav gavre ifluk. When the land was it divided into 12 equal portions? We'll talk about what equal means in a little bit. Was it divided into 12 equal portions, and then each tribe divided whatever equal portion they got to a different tribe among their people? Which would mean, by the way, that if you were a very large tribe, everybody in your tribe got a smaller part. If you were a very small tribe, everybody would get a larger part. Or was it divided exactly evenly between every person who, again, depends whether you go by Yotzei Mitzrayim, by Haaretz, but divided evenly by head. That's what karpaf is, by the head. So how is it divided? Tashma, the Gemara is going to bring two proofs, one from a pasuk and one from a braita. And from there, we're going to get off in a very long braita, which takes us till almost the end of Amud Aleph. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go in detail into explaining different parts of that braita. Okay, but the braita is brought for really one line of the braita, and from there, as usual, we get off into all sorts of other things, which are interesting in and of themselves. So first, the Gemara says, Tashma, we're going to learn it from the pasuk. Let's learn from here. Ben Rav Lema'at. Right, it's going. This was the pasuk where it said, Al Pia Goal Techalek Haaretz. The land is Al Techalek Nachalato. Each person is in Devarim chapter 26, verse 56. Each person's is going to get, right, everyone's going to get according to the Goral, Bain Rav Lama'at, whether they're large or whether they're small. Now what does it mean whether you're large or small? Again, this means whether you're going to get, right, whether you're going to get a larger portion or a smaller portion. Now, this indicates that some people got smaller portions, some people got larger portions. That must mean it was divided by tribe. And that's why some people ended up with smaller portions and some people ended up with larger ones. Ve'od Tanya, and furthermore, there's a braita that also indicates that it was divided by the tribes. Atida Eretz Israel shetitchalek l'shlosha asar shvatim. Much of this braita is going to be discussing Psukim in Yechezkel, Ezekiel, chapter 48, where it talks about the future and the time to come. And really what the commentary says, we're talking about Yemot Mashiach. They're going to call it Olam Haba, the world to come. But what they really mean, right, sometimes the word Olam Haba means the times of the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, things are going to be they're going to be different and kind of idyllic. So now we're going to understand one of the things that are going to happen is that the land is going to be divided into 13 tribes. Okay, why 13? We're going to have to wait and see. We don't yet know what the 13th is for. So now and then it's going to be divided into 13 equal parts as opposed to 12. There's our answer, because originally it was divided into 12, and the future will be divided into 13. And that's what they're going to say right now. Okay, because originally it was only in 12, and in the future it will be divided into 13. So that makes it very clear that this braita holds. So both the pasuk indicates that it was divided by tribes, and this braita. Okay, now, like I said, we're now going to continue on in the braita and get off on all sorts of other things. It was divided with money. What does that mean? It means that those who got a lesser portion, we're going to have to figure out what does that mean, a lesser portion, got compensated for it financially. They got money. Okay, now there's a big debate here. Okay, how do we know this? Some people got more, some people got less. So how do we fix that? Because it's not fair that anyone should get any less. So they were compensated financially. How this exactly worked, who was the one doing the compensating for who? Was this within the tribe or was this outside the tribe? And what are we talking about? The Gemara originally is going to think that we're talking about if we assume everyone got equal portions. Now, again, we just said not, they don't really, but again, within each tribe, everyone got an equal portion. Some people think that we're talking about, and I'm not being clear because it's really not clear. I'm just going to be clear about that. It's really not clear exactly what this means and how this works. Possibly it means that the tribes, like a tribe that got, now what we're going to say now is, we're going to assume, we're going to go with what the Gemara is going to think this means, but then we're going to change it. But right now, it seems like the Gemara thinks that what they're talking about is, when they read this braita, that if a tribe got better quality land, Remember, they all got equal portions, but a portion somewhere, okay, which we're going to see right now. Maybe I'll just read one more line. This is why the Gemara is going to think this. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, se'ah b'Yehuda shaveh chamesh se'im b'Galil. One se'ah in Judea is worth 5 in the Galil, meaning in Judea, again, right now, let's assume we're going to change this later. They have better quality land. Okay, we've already learned this. Idid, Tziburi, remember when it comes to payments? So you could get the same size portion, but it could be much better land than someone else who gets the same size portion and it's poor land. So again, either we're talking about with people within a tribe, let's say, the way it was divided within the tribe, because remember, within the tribe, it had to be equal. And then you could say, well, then if you each got an equal portion, but this one had better quality and that one had poor quality, then the people with more had to give to the people with less. If you're talking about tribes, then it would be this tribe had, like in Judea, Yehuda, the people from Yehuda had better land. So they had to compensate financially, and how financially? With money. They would pay money to someone who had less. Okay, so that's right now the way we're going to understand it. Later we'll see it's a little different. Okay, we're just going on to all sorts of details about this. Again, we're in the middle of the braita. The Gemara hasn't even said why we brought we know why we brought the braita to answer this question. We already said how it answered the question, but only when we finish the braita will the Gemara say, by the way, notice which words it said here, and notice how this answers our original question, right? Which was Eretz Yisrael divided by tribes, or was Eretz Yisrael divided by heads? So now we're just continuing on about different ways, different things about the distribution of land. It was distributed by lottery system. Shenemar ach begoral, because it says, okay, this is in Bamidbar 26 again, verse 55, before we read 56, ach begoral yechalek et haaretz. Okay, it will be divided by goral, by a lottery. And it was also divided by the urim tumim, which was this method the Kohanim had of kind of getting the Ruach HaKodesh from God to be able to see what God wanted. Shenemar al pia goral. Now, the pasuk we read before said al pia goral techalet nechalato bein rav lema'at, but we didn't really focus on these words. Al pia goral, by the right now, literally it means, right, al pi means by the way of the goral, but the word peh means by the mouth. So they understand from here, this must be a reference to the urim tumim, which is as if, right, we're getting the word of God from the urim tumim. So because one pasuk says big oral and the other one says al pi goral, they're saying, this must be, there were two different things. There was the lottery and there was the urim tumim. Now, haketzad, how on earth does this work? It's either you're going to do one way or you're going to do the other way. What if the goral said one thing and the urim tumim said something else? So how exactly did that work together? So we're going to see that it was kind of a miraculous way of working. In general, the urim tumim is miraculous, right? It's some method of getting the word of God, which is hard for us to understand. Elazar melubash urim tumim. So Elazar was kind of wearing the urim tumim, right? Because that was the stones would shine. That's how they explain the urim tumim. Also, on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. So he was the Kohen Gadol at the time. Elazar, the son of Aaron. Yehoshua v'chol Yisrael umdim lefanav. Now they would be standing in front of him, Yehoshua and all the Jews. V'kalpi shel shvatim v'kalpi shel tumim munachim lefanav. So he has number one, the urim tumim that he's wearing. Number two, he has a lottery, like a box, with little notes in it. So we have the shvatim in one, each of the names of the tribes, and in the other we have each of the 12 portions. And then he would, through the urim tumim, would get Ruach HaKodesh, what God said. And then he would read what came out of the urim tumim. V'omer zvulun oleh. I see zvulun. And tchum ako oleh imo. And I see that Akko is the land they're going to get, the area of Akko. And then taraf bekalpi shel shvatim. And then he would go to the kalpi to pick out from the lottery. So he would go to the kalpi of the shvatim. Alabiyados Zvulun, and miraculously, after it had just come up with the Urim Tumim Zvulun and Akko, he would pick out from the tribes, and Zvulun would come. Taraf b'kalpi shel tchumin, v'alabiyado tchum Akko, and then he would go to the portions, and Akko would come out. V'chozer, now we're going to see the same thing with Naphtali. They're just giving examples. Chozer mechabein b'ruach hakodesh v'omer Naphtali oleh utchum ginosar oleh bo. So then he would go back to the Urim Tumim. Naphtali would come up, and ginosar is the area they get. Tarat b'kapi shel shvatim, v'ala b'yado naftali. Tarat b'kapi shel tchumim, v'ala b'yado tchum ginosar. And then he would go to the kalpi and he would pick out, right? Again, pick out of the shvatim and pick out of the land, and the exact same thing would come up. V'chein kol shevet v'shevet. And this would go on and on for all the 12 tribes. Okay, so now we had, let's just go through what we went through in this braita. Number one, in the future time, it's going to be divided into 13. Because right now it was only divided into 12. And that was the important line for our purposes, because then we see the land was divided into 12 sections. Then we said about the money, that there was some compensation going on. After everyone got their land, we had to compensate somehow, either tribe by tribal or within each tribe. And Rabbi Yehuda explained that, the land Judea, let's say, for example, was worth more than the land in the Galil. And then we said this was all done by the Goral and the Urim Tumim. We had a description of how that went. Now we're going back for a minute to the future, to this time in the future based on Yechezkel. We're still in the same braita. And the braita says, Lo kechalukah shel ha'olam hazeh, chalukah shel ha'olam haba. The world to come, which again means in the times of the Mashiach, it's going to be different. How so? Ha'olam hazeh, adam yesh lo sedeh lavan, ein lo shtei pardes. In this world, you either have a field of grains or you have an orchard. Most people have one or the other. Shtei pardes and lo shtei lavan. So, right, if you have a shtei lavan, which is a field of wheat, then you don't have a pardes, an orchard. If you have an orchard, you don't have a field of wheat. Lo olam haba, ein lecha kol echad ve'echad she'ein lo bahar u'bashvela u'be'emek. This sounds nice for everyone who wants a vacation home in the mountains and you want a place in the valley. In the future, you're going to have everything. You're going to have every type of land there is. Everyone's going to have a part of everything. Shenema, how do we know this? It's actually a bit of a strange pasuk they're quoting, but it's in that same section in Yechezkel, that same chapter, and it's talking about the gates to Jerusalem. Now, everyone's going to have a gate, but because they add this word, it says Shareat Yer al Shmot Shivtei Israel, right? Each one is going to have in their name, or each tribe, a gate to Jerusalem, and then it says at the end of that pasuk, Shar Ruven Echad, Shar Yehuda Echad, Shar Levi Echad. Okay, Reuven's going to have one, Yehuda's going to have one, Levi's going to have one. Now, we already know that because we just said the tribes are going to each have a gate. So they're saying the reason why it says this one will have one, and this one will have one, and this one will have one, what it's trying to say is everyone's going to have everything equal. Okay, it's describing it's not just that we're going to all have nice vacation homes in the mountain home and this and that. It's saying that there's going to be this complete equality. Okay, like if we tried to have equality before, we already learned that it wasn't exactly equality, and some people had to be compensated for what they didn't have. And some people had this type of land, they didn't have that type of land. But in the future, everyone will have exactly identical. Okay, and they'll have a bit of everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mechalek lahem ba'atzmo. Another thing that's going to be in the future, it won't be through Goral, it will be God will give directly. Shenemar, how do we know this? Because it says, also in that chapter, but a few psukim before, in verse 19, this is all again, Yechezkel chapter 48, Ve'ela machloktam ne'um Hashem. And this is the way they will be divided. And then it says, and this is the word of God. Now, if you've read the prophets, you know that ne'um Hashem often comes up. It's kind of like a end quote, this is what God said. But because it's juxtaposed, the word, right, this is the word of God with, they're going to get a distribution, they say, they're going to be distributed, Nu'um Hashem, by the word of God. Okay, and that's how it's understood. Where do they have this concept of the word of God? We're going to see in a minute. But there were some people who actually, even in the desert, even on the entrance to the land, got land based on the word of God. Like that was a unique, special way that was reserved for special people. In the future, it will be for everybody. Again, kind of talking about this equality, this ideal of equality. So anyway, we're done with the braita now, and then we're going to get back and deal with certain parts of the braita that didn't make so much sense or that the Gemara wants to delve into further. But again, why did we bring this braita? So they remind us, because we got sidetracked from a very long braita, which again, went back and forth between what was then and what will be in the future. Katani mihad. Well, anyway, it said in this braita, B'tchila lo nitzchalka ela l'shnei masar shvatim. In the beginning was only divided by, in the beginning, it was only divided into 12, right? And then the future will be divided into 13. What do you see? Shma mina l'shvatim iflu. From here, we can understand it was divided by tribe and not by head. It wasn't that every person got an equal portion. Every person within the tribe got an equal portion. And each tribe got an equal portion to the other tribes. But if you compared all the Jews, not everybody had an equal portion. Amar Mar. And now we're going to have a series of Amar, right? We're going to go back to different parts that were said in the braita and explain. Atida Eretz Yisrael shetitchalek l'shlosha asar shvatim. Right? It'll be divided into 13 tribes. What 13 tribes? Idach Leman. So what's the 13th for? Now you might say Shevet Levi, for example, who didn't get Nachala, but no, it's not Shevet Levi. Okay, they don't even get Nachala in the future. They just have their cities, right? But no one really has like their own special portion. But there are Levite cities all around. So what do we do with the other 13th portion? Who's it for? Amarav Chesta la Nasi. It's for the Nasi. Some people explain it's for the Mashiach. Okay, for the one in charge in that time. Dichtiv. Now, where do we get this from? The Ha'oved Ha'il. Okay, Oved Ha'ir means the most prominent person in the city. Ya'avduhu mikol shiftei Israel. Now, the way they understand the word Ya'avduhu, which could be understood differently, the Gemara is going to question why we don't understand differently. But Yavduhu sounds like they're going to work for him. But what it means is Yavduhu mikol shiftei Israel, all the Shvatim are going to give him a part of theirs, and we're going to end up with this 13th portion. So it's going to be redivided by everybody giving a little bit of theirs to the Nasi, and the Nasi is going to end up with an equal portion to all the other tribes. Amalei Rav Papa Labai. So Rav Papa says, Ema Rungal Ba'alma. Maybe it's really just that they're going to all give servants to this Nasi. And they're all like the word, Ya'avduhu. Sounds like they'll work for him. And that everyone will give a kind of a tax of, I'll work for 4 months and I'll work for 4 months. And maybe that's what it means. Maybe it doesn't mean land. To which they say, Lo Salkadatach. It doesn't make sense because of a different pasuk there. Again, all these pasukim are from this chapter in Yechezkel, 48. Dirtiv. V'hanotal lanasi mizeh mizeh l'trumat hakodesh u'lachuzat ha'ir. And all the remainder from there and there, meaning the Nasi is going to get parts from each of the tribes. Okay, that's the way they understand. And then the Truma HaKodesh L'Achazat Ha'ir, there's a lot of different ways of explaining what this end of the pasuk means. It's not really so important for our purposes because what we want is he's going to get Mizeh and Mizeh. Sounds like, and then in addition, maybe there's the Truma HaKodesh and Achuzat Ha'ir. In other words, he's going to get part from all the different properties everyone has, and then also in Jerusalem where the Kodesh is, that'll be for the city or something like that. Not exactly clear how to read that part. So the first part we dealt with was what's this 13th portion? It's going to go to the Nasi. So there'll be the 12 tribes, and then the Nasi will have an equal portion to all the 12 tribes. So the way we understood this was, if you got better quality land, then you'd have to compensate someone else who had lesser quality. If we're talking about better quality, poorer quality, that shufra is good and sanya is bad. What are we talking about? Fools? No fool would take poor land, would agree to get poor land. What are we assuming? Let's say it's within the tribe. So each tribe got a certain amount, and then they divided up into actual equal portions, right? Everybody gets a 5x5 space or whatever size, and 50 by 50, I don't know. And then, some got better quality and some got poorer quality. No one's going to be willing to take a poor quality piece of land that's the exact same size as their neighbor who got a great quality piece of land. Nobody would do that. So it can't be that that's what they did. Now, let's go back to when we learned about Edid and Ziburit, right? Edid is the best land. Ziburit is the worst land. If you remember, there's different obligations. You either have to pay with the best, or you can pay with the worst land. If you're going to pay with the worst land, and let's say you owe 100 shekels, you're going to pay 100 shekels worth of bad land, which will be a bigger piece than 100 shekels worth of good land. It's just a matter of how big a size of piece do you have to give. It's going to be poor land, it's going to be bigger. If it's going to be good land, it's going to be smaller. So what they're basically assuming is when we talk about dividing equally, we obviously mean equal in value. So if you got a good piece and I got a bad piece, my bad piece was obviously bigger than your piece. So there's no need for compensation there. We each got a piece of land worth $10,000, let's say, or whatever it might be. Okay? That's obvious. So it can't be that, and if we're talking about by tribes, then the same thing. This tribe that got better quality land would get a smaller portion than the tribe that got poor quality land. So what could it mean then? That there was some compensation, financial compensation going for someone who got lesser or more. Ela likrova urechoka. So it must be for closer and farther. And what they seem to mean here is closer to Jerusalem and farther from Jerusalem. And maybe that's why they gave the example of Yudah and the Galil. So Yudah is very close to Jerusalem, whereas the Galil, the Galilee, is very far from Jerusalem. So it all had to do with how close or how far your portion was to Jerusalem. And that's what they had to be compensated. So the value, now it's nowadays for sure value depends on location as well. But what they're claiming is that the value of the land itself, of how much crops how good your crops, what you could grow there is going to be equal. But how close you are to Jerusalem is a whole different story. And that people had to be compensated. So now they say kitanai. And by the way, the fact that this braita says that people had to then compensate financially to others for the people who were farther from Jerusalem is a machloket tanaim. Now, what's the machloket? Question is going to be, how do you compensate? Yes, you compensate according to everybody, but how? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer b'ksafim ha'elua. So Rabbi Eliezer says, just like the braita, it was with money. But Rabbi Yehoshua Omer b'karka ha'elua. He said, no, you had to pay them back in land. Okay, they had to be paid back in land. This, by the way, is obviously a little bit trickier because if you're talking about tribes paying back other tribes, how are they paying back in land? You're talking about within a tribe, whoever was closer to Jerusalem would end up having to compensate the ones farther so then they could give them a piece of their land. If you're saying tribe to tribe, I don't know how exactly they get that you would be doing land. How could you possibly give land from your tribe to a different tribe? Anyway, okay. Now we're going back to this line about the goral. Shenemar ach begoral, because it says by goral. Tana ach begoral. Now the word ach, which they didn't focus on at all in the braita, the word ach is always really means but by goral. Now why would you say but? It's a word that always indicates what we call tzimtzum, some sort of limitation. It doesn't mean everything was done in that way. So right until now, we said everyone was divided by the goral and apia goral. So we had the kalpi, which was, the ballot, the pulling out of straws, the lottery, and we had the urim v'tumim. So the question is now, what is this word ach doing there? And now they're going to bring a braita. In other words, we're not really talking about, we're now leaving our braita, but we're focusing on a line from the braita and saying, oh, but by the way, there was an exception, two exceptions. Yatzu Yehoshua and Caleb. Okay, Yehoshua and Caleb were out of the goral. So now the Gemara says, what do you mean they were out of the goral? What, they didn't get land? Which you can't possibly say. Why? Well, what did we learn about them? They took the land of the spies, remember? So, if you're saying they just didn't get land in the goral, didn't get land at all, if they already got someone else's portion, what, they didn't get their own portion? No way. Of course they got their own portion. They were rewarded that they also got the portion of the spies, and according to some, even the portion of Korah. So, of course, it can't be they didn't get any land. Now we go back to this by God, by the word of God. They were the only ones who got their portion based on the word of God. Okay, now we have to see, where do we know this from? Yoshua dechtiv al pi Hashem natznu lo et ha'ir asher sha'al etim natzerach b'har Ephraim. So here it says in Sefer Yoshua that by the word of God, it says it explicitly, he was given the city, which was Timnat Serach in Har Ephraim. Okay, now we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent, moving now to Amabet. Ktiv Serach uchtiv Cheres. Okay, now in Sefer Yoshua, the pasuk we just quoted, it was called Timnat Serach. That was the part that Yoshua got. But in the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, chapter 2, verse 9, it says that he was buried in the gvul, in the border of his Nachalah, B'timnat Cheres. Now, you might notice they're the same letters, but spelled differently, right? Moved like a word scramble. First it says Serach, then it says Cheres. It's switching the Chet and the Samach. So we're going to learn from this something. We're going to have two different opinions. They both are basically saying that when Yehoshua got it, in the beginning, it wasn't so great, but the land later was amazing. In other words, I guess, as he cultivated it produced many fruits. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, B'tchila, they're just going to use the words in the reverse, which one it was first and which one it was second, but both say that there was an improvement. B'tchila peorotah kecheres. In the beginning, they were like shards of earthenware vessels, which are hard and dry. It's not exactly a good thing for a fruit. Ulevasof peorotah masrichin. Now, the word masrich usually means they would rot, but it doesn't mean that here. Obviously, that would be a bad thing. What it means is they were so, right, that if you if you have them so soft and juicy, eventually they're going to rot. But what it means is they were so plump and juicy, the fruits, over time. So they started out dry and wrinkled, and ended up like really amazing fruits. Now, it's a little bit strange, this order, because Cheres was where it was mentioned at the time of his death. It's a little bit weird, and that's possibly why there's a second opinion. Some people say, and they say, no, first it was masrichin, meaning they were juicy, which I guess was a good thing, but they rotted very quickly. And later they were drier, which means that they were able to be stored for the long term. And that was the positive thing. They became like cheres. Okay, so the first one was saying, how could you say cheres was a good thing? It must have been the cheres was first, even though it was mentioned second. Second one finds a better explanation for how cheres would be a good thing. Okay, that was a tangent we got off of because we were talking about how Yehoshua got his goral by the word of God, and we quoted that pasuk. And once we had Serach, we said, why does it mention in different places cheres? Now we go to Caleb. Dichtiv, Yitnu leKalev et Chevron, kasher diber Moshe. This is also in the beginning of Shoftim, chapter 1, verse 20. They gave Chevron to Caleb as Moshe said. Vayorish misham et shlosha b'nei ha'anak, and then he they settled this land that belonged originally to the three giants. Now, the sons of the giants. Now, the question is, where did Moshe say to Caleb? Okay, so the Rashbam quotes this pasuk, ve'chan diber, and then it's, by the way, from the word of God, because the word of God as it was passed to Moshe. Doesn't ever say al pi Hashem like it does by Yehoshua. So now the Rashbam says, where did Moshe say this? Dichtiv, and they quote a pasuk from the first chapter of Sefer Dvarim, V'lo etan et haaretz asher darach ba ulevanav, and I then promised Caleb the land that he walked on. And how do we know that that's Hebron? Okay, it doesn't say it explicitly, but there's, as it says in the Agadah, Vayavo ad Hebron. Okay, this is a bit of a strange thing with that pasuk. Why does it says Vayavo and not Vayavo? It's all the Meraglim, and then it says, and he went to Hebron, as if it was just one person. So the Midrash says, Melamed shenishtach Kalev al ma'arat kivrei tzadikim shebechevron. What's in Hebron? Maran Machpelah. So the Midrash says that Kalev went. Okay, this isn't in the Pshat. Midrash says that Caleb went and prayed at Maran Machpelah, Shatzilei U'Me'otzat Meraglim, right? And that explains why Caleb, again, it's the Midrash's explanation, why he was saved and didn't join the other spies, because he went and prayed in Hebron, and on account of that, they say, because he was the one who vayavo at Hebron, only he went to Hebron according to the Midrash. And then when Moshe said, you're going to get the land that you walked in, that must be a reference to Hebron. And how do we know that? Well, because in the end, he gets Hebron. So they put all the dots together, and that's how they build this story, right? This case. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, how could Hebron be a city given to Caleb? Hebron Ir Miklat Habai. We know that Hebron was an Ir Miklat, and an Ir Miklat, or a refuge city for the Rotzeach Bishkaga, the one who kills accidentally, they're always in Levite cities. So how could it be Caleb's if it was a Levite city? So Amar Abaye, Parvareha. Okay, it's the Parvarim. It was the suburbs, the outskirts. He settled outside of Hebron, all the areas outside of Hebron. Hebron itself was an Ir Miklat, but what Caleb got was everything around Hebron. And that's another pasuk they quote from Yehoshua, that he got the Stea, meaning, remember, the fields are always outside the city, and the Chatzera and the courtyards around, all the parts that are outside the city and not actually the inside, the city itself. Okay, so I'm going to review this part of the daf before we move on to the next part. I won't review it at the end, because it's a totally different topic. Our big question here was, how did they divide the land? By shvatim or by heads? In the end, we said it must be by shvatim, both from the pasuk and from the braita. From there, we got into a very long braita, which dealt with all sorts of issues, whether, talking about there had to be some compensation going on from somebody to somebody about people who got better quality land. In the end, we said it wasn't better quality, it was better location. Quality was already dealt with in the division, already from the beginning. That nobody got a bigger, when we say bigger portion, small, equal portion, we mean equal in value, not equal in size. That's very important. But location, you can't, right? That was compensated for in a different way, either by money or by land. And then we had this issue of the future, how in the future it'll be divided by 13 tribes and not 12. And then from there we got into that also everybody will have equal portions, right? Who's the 13th? The Mashiach will get, or the Nasi, as we call him, will get the 13th portion. That again will be a part. Everybody will give part of their portion to this 13th. And also in the future time, everybody will get equal parts of all different kinds of land. Okay, again, describing this ideal situation, which will be, okay, that's basically, and then we had that even though it's begoral, there were, right, and then we described how the goral was done with the urim, tumim, and the kalpi, and then we said there's also, there were two people, though, who didn't get it by the goral, who got it al pi Hashem. Just like in the future, everybody will get al pi Hashem, but in that time, it was just Yehoshua and Caleb, and that we prove from the Psukim. Now we're going to have a Mishnah that from the get-go already doesn't really make so much sense. We're going to have 4 different explanations. For this, I put together a study guide. You can, if someone wants to reshare it in the chat for those who came later. We're going to have 4 different interpretations. The first 3 are going to all be rejected. And the main problem is going to be the connection between part 1 and part 2 in the Mishnah. There's like a continuum of a sentence where the second part of the sentence doesn't really make sense in light of the first. And because of that, we're going to have to try to figure out what the Mishnah is talking about. And we'll end with, we'll end with basically the 4th, which finally works. And then we'll end with the beginning of the next daf, which is, it's going to start at the end of our daf, which I promised, we started with a question. We're going to end with the question, and that question we'll deal with tomorrow's class. So, when a son inherits and when a daughter inherits, right, the daughter's going to inherit when there's no sons, which we already know. They're equal. They do it in the same way. We're not sure. There's something the same about the ben and the bat, which we don't know exactly what this is yet, when they inherit land or anything really. Then it says Ella, but, okay, so they're very similar. And now you're expecting to see or hear a difference between the boy inheriting and the girl inheriting, but it's not exactly what you're going to see, and that's what causes confusion here. Ella shahaben notel pishnayim b'nechsei ha'av ve'eino notel pishnayim b'nechsei ha'em. Now there is a little difference here between ben and bat, but what they're going to say is when a son gets pishnayim, it's not saying a son gets pishnayim but the daughter doesn't. That's what you would have expected, right? So sons and daughters are the same, except that sons get pishnayim if they're the firstborn and the daughters don't. But that's not what it says. It says sons, when they get pishnayim, they only get it from their father, not their mother. So it starts off with the gender similarity or difference, but comparing banim and banot. But then the real difference in the second part, and it's there they say it's all the same, except for it's going to be different in this way. But when they talk about the differences, they're talking about the differences between inheriting from mother and father. Now it's a gender difference still, but it's not the same gender difference. It's not between those inheriting, it's who they're inheriting from. And what they're saying is that when a son inherits from the mother, the son doesn't get pishnayim. So if the father dies first and then the mother dies, because if the mother dies first, then the father inherits. But if the mother doesn't have a husband, then it'll go to her children. And her son, if she's a bechor, even if he was a bechor for the father, won't get pishnayim of the mother's property. But he gets pishnayim of his father's property. And habanot, and the daughters, when the father dies and there's sons, the daughters don't get inheritance at all. The sons get all the inheritance. However, it's a promise in the ketubah, which you might remember from Seder Nashim, that, and particularly Mashiach Ketubot, that it's one of the conditions of the ketubah is that not only does the woman, the wife of the deceased, get mizonot payments until she collects her ketubah money, she can get monthly food payments, but also it's a promise that he'll feed the daughters also, meaning that if there's an inheritance and an estate of the husband that he leaves, before the sons inherit, we give money, or the sons can inherit everything, but they have to give money to the daughters to eat. They're responsible for the daughters till they get married. So that's a t'nai ketubah. It's a commitment the husband makes to the wife and to their future daughters in the ketubah. Therefore, when the father dies, the banot nizonot minichsei ha'av, they'll get money from there. So if there's not enough money for also inheritance and also food, the girls went out actually. But if it's the mother who dies, the good daughters don't get that because the mother didn't make any commitments in the ketubah. The ketubah is what the husband commits to the wife. So we have a problem here, because, right? Not a problem, but we have a difference. So if you notice, both those differences aren't between banim and banot. Now it's true, one issue is a issue for the boys and one issue is an issue for the girls, but it's really saying that there's a difference between the girls and the inheritance from the mother and the inheritance of the father. So now the Gemara is going to ask, so what are we talking about in the first part? Because the first part has to connect with the second part. And not only that, if we're saying what it really sounds like, sounds like they're totally equal in nachala, which could mean something against everything we've already learned, which could mean if it means they both inherit 50-50, you have a boy and a girl, they're going to share the inheritance. Well, Hatzna, we already know, ben koden lebat, the son comes before the daughter, we've learned this already, and kol yotzei recho shabat ben kodmin lebat. And any of the son's children, even if the son's not alive anymore, but leaves children, his children will inherit and the daughters won't. So that can't be what it means. So what does it mean? We have a siman nafsham. That's a siman for the 4 rabbis who are going to give answers. So Nun is Rav Nachman, we're going to see, and then so on and so on. Am Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, kachi kamar. This is how you should read it. Both of them not only inherit what the father had in his possession at the time of death, but they also inherit things that are going to come to the father later. Like, for example, and we learned this with Tzlofchad, that when Tzlofchad died and then Chefer died after, Tzlofchad inherited his father. And when he inherited his father, that inheritance went to his children, right, to the daughters. So that means that they get even things that haven't yet come into the father's possession are going to go to them as well. But if you say that's what it means, we have 2 problems with this. Number 1, Hanami Tanina, we already have a Mishnah that tells us this. We don't need a Mishnah to tell us something we already know. We already learned exactly what I just told you. We learned that in a Mishnah. They got their father's chelek, but this is the important one. They also got the portion that Chefer was supposed to give to Tzlofchad. They got that as well, even though Tzlofchad hadn't gotten it yet because Tzlofchad was dead, right? And Tzlofchad died before his father. So we already know that, number 1. So there's no point for our Mishnah to tell us that. Ve'od, and as I pointed out from the beginning, my Ella. If you're going to say that males and females are the same in terms of their inheriting from their father, even things that weren't in their father's possession at the time of death, well, then that has nothing to do with the second part, which is all about the difference between inheriting from a mother and inheriting from the father. So that doesn't make any sense. El Amar of Papa, second explanation. Hachi Kamar, read it like this. They each get a portion of the firstborn, meaning, this doesn't mean girls, there is no firstborn, but it means that if their father was a firstborn and died before their grandfather, right, the father's father, then when the father inherits, and the father was a firstborn, and this again, we learn from Tzlofchad. Tzlofchad was a firstborn, he died first. Then when Chefer died, the daughters of Tzlofchad got the 2 portions of the Bechor. Okay, so also the Bechorah passes down to girls as well as to boys. But obviously we already learned that as well in the Mishnah. Same type of question as before. Hanami Tanina. We also learned that in the Mishnah. Why did they get 3 portions? Because they also got the double portion of their fathers. So we don't need this Mishnah to tell us that if we already have that. Ve'od, my Ella. And the Ella still doesn't work because, again, we're talking about girls inheriting versus boys inheriting, right? Saying it's the same. And then we're saying, but there is one difference. And what's the difference? There's a difference between those who inherit from the mother and those who inherit from the father, which has nothing to do with the boys and girls. So that doesn't work. Okay, third explanation. Ela Amarav Ashi, Hachi Kamar. This is how you should read it. Echa ben abanim, ve'echa bat ben abanot. Whether you have one son among many sons, or one daughter among many daughters, when you have no sons. Im amal yirash kol nechasai dvarav kayamim. If the father says, I want only one of you, this daughter I want to inherit everything, or this son I want to inherit everything, then that works. Again, only if there's no sons for the daughter. That will work both for sons or daughters. Now, if that's what our Mishnah is telling us, they're saying that's a problem. Why? Because Kiman, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, what you're holding like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who's going to appear in a Mishnah on Daf Kuf Lamed. Now, if so, Hakatani Leila Kaman. First of all, he appears in the Mishnah Daf Kuf Lamed. This exact halacha. So why would you say it here? Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Mamar Misha Ra'oi Yorsho Dvarav Kayami. Amisheino Ra'oi Yorsho Ein Dvarav Kayami. If somebody says I'm giving Joe Schmo all my property, that doesn't work. But if he says he's giving it to someone who can inherit from him, either one of his sons as opposed to all the rest of them, or he has no sons and he says it to a daughter. Well, if that's what our Mishnah is saying, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says it on Daf Kuf Lamed, meaning further on in the Mishnah in this chapter. V'chi tema, and if you want to say, kastamlan to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, well, maybe what we're saying is, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he put together the Mishnah, he put this Mishnah here to say, when you get to that one later, here I'm just saying it without saying it's a machloket. So you'll see later it's a machloket, but I'm putting it here because this is how we hold. Well, that doesn't work because stam v'achar kach machloket, stam v'achar kach machloket, ein halacha k'stam. There's rules about that. If you have a machloket and then you have a stam mishnah that holds by one side of that machloket, and the order is machloket and then stam, then it shows that we hold like the stam because the last word, you're getting the last word in kind of is the stam opinion. But here it's the reverse. You're first bringing the stam opinion and then you're bringing a machloket. Well, it doesn't show anything if you do that, in which case there would be no point to do that and bring this mishnah like that. So that's number one. And you already know what the second question is, which is, Ve'od, my Ella. What's this Ella doing here? This Ella makes no sense. So finally, we're going to get to the actual good answer. Ella, because again, why does the Ella make no sense? Because we're talking about sons and daughters, and then we're switching to inheriting from the mother, inheriting from the father. So Ella Amar Mar Bar Rav Ashi, Hachi Kamar. So the son of Rav Ashi, Mar says, what does he do? He adds the nechsei ha'em and the nechsei ha'av into the reisha, and then it all makes sense. He says sons and daughters inherit equally, but in the same manner from their mothers and from their father's property, other than these minor differences, which is when girls inherit from, right, when the mother dies, the girls won't get mizona, well, they will get mizona from the father, and when boys inherit and they're a bechor, they're not going to get their pishnayim from the mother or the father. So he resolves all the issues because number one, this isn't a halacha we learned before, and number two, or not one that is going to be learned later, and number two, it fits perfectly because he already mentions the nechsei ha'av and nechsei ha'em in the first part, and then that leads in perfectly to the second part. So now he says, so again, they both inherit equally from the mother and the father. Now the problem here is that the girl, it's not really inheritance. So really only the first part makes sense here. Okay, we're going to read it like this. They both inherit equally in the same manner, whether they're inheriting from their mothers or whether they're inheriting from their fathers. But but there is one difference, which is when the son inherits from the mother, he won't get the pishnayim if he's the firstborn. Then you have to just explain that last line about the daughters getting sustenance, their mizonot, their parnasa money from the father, but not from the mother. That's just an add-on because they already made this distinction with the boys. They come up with this distinction. It's not really an inheritance distinction because they're not inheriting in this case, but it's just an add-on because it kind of relates to another difference here. Okay, so it has a bit of a weakness because that last one doesn't really belong, but you could sort of explain it that it's there tangentially. Now we're going to end with the braita. So what we did in this section, just to review, and then we'll finish up, is we had a mishnah that first part and second part didn't really go well together. We had 3 attempts to try to figure it out. They all got rejected. And then we finally have a 4th explanation, which just kind of needs to add a few more words into the reisha to make it fit with the sefer, right? The first part to make it fit with the second. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're starting a braita about the bechor and the pishnayim. If we already mentioned in this mishnah about the bechor, so now we're going to talk about the pishnayim of a bechor. Pishnayim ke'echad. So the braita says, what does it mean, pishnayim? It means that however many brothers there are, the bechor is going to get 2 times the portions that everybody else is getting. So that means if there's 5 brothers, we're going to divide up the property into 6 portions. 2 portions go to the firstborn and 4 portions go divided equally between the other 4 brothers. But now the braita suggests perhaps a different way of, which I don't think you've ever thought of this unless you've learned this. But if you didn't learn this sugya, you probably would have thought of this question. But the braita suggests maybe it's something else. And that's why I said we're going to end with a question. You say they get pishnayim like, meaning double each one. But maybe it's pishnayim of everything, meaning, just like if you had 2 brothers, what would happen? One would get 2/3 and the other would get 1/3. Maybe every bechor gets 2 portions, 2 out of 3 of the father's property. And then the last third is divided evenly by all the brothers, right? This would be an unfortunate situation for anyone who's not a bechor. And they would have to divide the other third. Maybe that's the way it is. So now the braita is going to have to prove how we know that this is not the case. Okay, so that's our last question we're going to be left with. So with this, we'll finish our daf. I already did the review as we were learning it, so we're going to stop here for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Choref Tov, as they say in Hebrew, and unfortunately, we need a lot of bakashot for B'sorot Tovot. It's not an easy chag. Wishing everyone all of those.